Let's zero in on some songs from the end of 1966 into 1967 to get a kind of closer look at some of the things that I've been talking about when surveying these two big albums, Aftermath and Between the Buttons from 66 and early 67. The first song I want to start out with is Have You Seen Your Mother Baby Standing in the Shadow? This one, the B-side to it, in the US and the UK is a song called Who's Driving Your Plane? And you know, we've been talking about these covers on these two albums from 66 into 67. We haven't said a lot about blues. There has been some blues there, but considering where the Stones came from, for Pete's sake, they came out of that British blues revival movement. There hasn't been an overwhelming amount of blues, but this track, Who's Driving Your Plane, this B-side, there's another really good example of the Rolling Stones going back to their roots in blues music, writing their own blues and performing it. So another kind of overlooked track, but worthy, certainly worthy of your listening and your attention. So Have You Seen Your Mother Baby Standing in the Shadow, recorded in August of 66 at RCA and then finished up in September at IBC in London, where Glyn Johns was working. This one is interesting because it's got horns on it, and the horns are arranged by Mike Leander. And you maybe remember the name Mike Leander as being the guy who arranged the strings on As Tears Go By, and of course went on to, at about the same time, arrange the strings for the Beatles' She's Leaving Home, which is recorded in the first half of 1967 for the Sgt. Pepper record. And this is because Mike Leander was a big arranger, film music, TV music kind of guy around London, so he was available. Anyway, those are his horns that we're hearing in Have You Seen Your Mother Baby, his arrangement. The form of this track is what I call a modified AABA. Modified because you get the AABA form, and then the only thing that comes back at the end is one more verse, one more A section. So it kind of goes intro, which has the wah-wah fuzz and feedback thing. Oh, a lot of people are really proud of the introduction of this tune because it has this sort of wah-wah, feedback, fuzz kind of sound before it gets rolling. And then, that, of course, that comes back at the very end, just the distorted guitar sort of bathed in a rich sea of reverb. But all that kind of, sort of loud, distorto kind of sound, and you would say, aha! They must have been influenced by Hendrix here, right? Because he was the guy for feedback and those kinds of sounds. Well, it turns out that Hendrix didn't actually play his first live gig in London. And Hendrix broke in London before he broke in the United States. He played around the country in the United States, that's for sure, but when Chaz Chandler brought him back, the first gig his band played was after this song had been recorded. So if they got all that feedback and stuff from somebody, they may have gotten from The Who. Pete Townsend and Keith Moon kind of like to destroy their auto-destruct thing. They stopped doing because it was too expensive, or they bring cheap guitars out, but there was an awful lot of noise that was made when they did that. Of course, there's feedback at the beginning of the Beatles' I Feel Fine, but I think it's a fairly innovative introduction to this tune, so I want to give the Stones credit for not following what somebody else has done, but innovating here in their own way. Well, that's just the introduction to the tune. It's snappy. We get a verse that has a refrain that begins each verse. So you get the refrain at the beginning of each verse and then different lyrics to follow it each time. So you get a verse, each of those acting as A sections. Then you get a bridge, which is the B section. It gets very quiet for contrast and then builds. That's a technique they're going to use a couple more times. That is, come to the contrasting B section and bring it way down and then build it back up again. And that's what happens here. It builds to a return of the verse, and then, as I say, after you get the intro, the AABA, you get another verse, and then a coda with that distorted guitar that comes back at the end. Now, the lyrics refer to a shadowy life and shadowy love relationships. And this is maybe a celebration of lifestyles traditional society sees as decadent, maybe. Maybe it's a kind of an embrace, a celebration of, square, straight people would think that these kinds of lifestyles are decadent, but we know there's an attraction and an excitement there. And so, well, you might think that, but you might say, well, that's a little bit fanciful. There is a little bit more evidence that that's kind of where the song is going, and that Have You Seen Your Mother Baby Standing in the Shadows, the idea of standing in the shadows, indicating a kind of a shadowy, forbidden kind of lifestyle, is kind of borne out by the promo picture that was done for this single. The promo photo, there's a video that was done for it as well that incorporates these images. It features the Rolling Stones in drag. So all 5 of the Rolling Stones all dressed up like women. There's a little sort of tasteless mangling of the legs of one of them in a wheelchair, which is probably they would have done it differently had they done it today. But there they are, all of them dressed up like women, and you wonder whether the song is really suggesting not just sexuality but transvestism, right? As a kind of that's what's in the shadows, that's what's hidden, but it has a sort of certain kind of excitement and kind of sexual attraction, and that's kind of what this is all about. So I would ask you to read back through the lyrics again, listen to the song again, wondering whether or not what they're really doing is in a not even so secret way, saying that there are all kinds of different kind of love and sexual relationships, some that are forbidden and some that are not, and sometimes the forbidden ones are the best ones. I'm wondering if maybe that's what they're saying. Again, whether they believe it or not, who knows, but there is this idea of trying to say things that will shock people, having seen the great effect that I Can't Get No Satisfaction was able to have, and of course the dissatisfaction of, hey, you get off of my cloud. So it's not sort of outside of their wheelhouse to do that kind of a thing. Well, let's move on to Let's Spend the Night Together. Well, I was just talking about a song that could be somewhat provocative. Let's Spend the Night Together, as we talked about already, a song that, because of its lyrics, seemed to be courting scandal. And of course, scandal would soon arrive, as we talked about, by virtue of the drug bust that occurred in February of '62. Let's Spend the Night Together, I'll remind you, has got lyrics that are provocative, pleading with a girl for sex, making assurances, and in so doing, as I said before, I think courting scandal, trying to be provocative, saying things that they know polite society is going to object to. Of course, they think that polite society is hypocritical, that all kinds of crazy things go on behind the scenes of polite society. But nevertheless, that's the eye that this song is the stick poking into. Anyway, the form of the song is something we call a compound AABA. It features an intro and then a verse and a chorus. Each verse-chorus pair constitute kind of the A section. So you get a verse-chorus, that's the first A, and another verse-chorus, that's the second A, and then a bridge, and then a return to the verse-chorus pair again, and then a coda. So you get a big overall AABA with a contrasting verse-chorus occurring inside of each A section. As I said before, there's an intro and a coda. What's interesting for me is this bridge, again, gets very quiet and refers to classical music. When they go into that bridge section, it almost sounds, again, like Beach Boys kind of vocals. Think about Good Vibration and that kind of thing. And then, of course, it builds up, not unlike Have You Seen Your Mother, Baby, before it does. And employs the chorus at the very end before it breaks back in to the return of the verse and the chorus. This track recorded at Olympic Studios, both this one and Ruby Tuesday, which we'll talk about next, both recorded in the winter of 1966 at Olympic Studios with piano by Jack Nietzsche. So again, Jack Nietzsche is the guy playing that piano intro on Let's Spend the Night Together. All right, so so far we've had two songs that are fairly provocative, or that I've argued are maybe attempting to provoke. Let's move on to the B side from Let's Spend the Night Together. It comes out of the same sessions that got us the A section, the A side, and the B side I want to talk about is Ruby Tuesday. And this song has got a form that's a contrasting verse-chorus. We've certainly seen those before. The verse section is very classical sounding, and if you wonder what that low sound is that sounds like it could be some kind of sitar, it's a little bit buzzy, that's Bill Wyman playing the stand-up bass using a bow. Right? And so there's certainly, in addition to the kind of classical structure of the chord and the melody and all that kind of thing, there's also the idea of the bowed bass and Brian Jones over there on the recorder. So the song really is almost a kind of, a real sort of proto-psychedelic tune in terms of the way it puts a lot of these different kinds of sort of psychedelic stylistic traits together, different use of different instruments, importing classical music, that kind of thing. So the contrasting verse-chorus form here gives us a verse, a chorus, a verse, a chorus, a verse, a chorus, and then a repeated chorus, and then a coda. And listen to that coda. Boy, if there was ever a Rolling Stones song with a strong classical reference, it's the way this song, Ruby Tuesday, ends. It's very, very traditional in that way. The lyrics describe a free-spirited woman who cannot be tied down and is dedicated to following her dreams. There couldn't be more contrast between the woman that's being described here in Ruby Tuesday and some of the others that we talked about in the last song, Close Up, with regard to the perhaps misogynistic or leaning toward, at least very critical of women kinds of lyrics, 19th Nervous Breakdown, Mother's Little Helper, and those tunes. So these ones describe a free-spirited woman who cannot be tied down and is dedicated to following her dreams, no matter what straight culture, no matter what the square culture believes, she's going to go where she's going to go. She's a free spirit. It makes me wonder if this is a song about Marianne Faithfull, because just at about this time, she was, well, of course, they'd known her for some years, or some time anyway, because she'd done As Tears Go By. And she was also being managed by Andrew Loog Oldham, so they were part of the same circle of friends and acquaintances. But it very much describes somebody who reminds you quite a bit of Marianne Faithfull, and you wonder whether the classical references also support that, being that As Tears Go By was really their first song to use those kinds of classical references. So I don't know if that's really the case here, but whoever it's about, or if it's about nobody in particular, but a particular personality type, it's definitely much more complimentary and endorsing of a woman or a type of woman than some of the other stuff. So it's only fair to point out both sides of this debate about the kinds of things that the Stones are capable of in their music. Well, we finally turn now to the song Cool, Calm, Collected, which I sort of push a little bit forward for everybody to consider because I think it's got some great stuff for us to dig into here. It was released on Between the Buttons, as we've mentioned, produced by Andrew Oldham and recorded at RCA and then at Olympic. We've gone through all the recording stuff for the album Between the Buttons. The form itself is a contrasting verse-chorus, but here's what's interesting about the verse-chorus here. It's a contrasting verse-chorus, and after the intro, which is in a kind of, music hall kind of style, imagine, sort of British seaside entertainment, right? And the verse, each verse is in this kind of music hall style with this kind of, a sort of loud, buoyant piano in the background, honky-tonky kind of piano. But then when they get the chorus, it's like they go into an entirely different style. The chorus is in this kind of pseudo-Indian style. Now, they don't use the sitar, but they play the electric 12-string guitar as if it were a kind of a sitar. And then the melody seems to veer away from a kind of an Indian kind of thing into something that sounds like a kind of American hoedown or something. I'm not really quite sure where they're going with that, but there's such a fantastic contrast between the music hall style and the almost Indian meditative kind of style. And it happens when the lyrics talk about how the woman being described here is cool, calm, and collected. So it seems like when all the stuff is happening around her, and we'll talk about the lyrics in just a minute, all the kind of hustle bustle of the real world, it's this music hall kind of thing. But then when we get to her inner space, it's this kind of meditative kind of thing that George Harrison would have been proud to have written. And the song goes on like that, alternating rowdy verses with these meditative choruses, and in fact expanding the choruses to create some more sort of instrumental kind of sort of quasi virtuoso kind of sitar-ish 12-string, electric 12-string playing. A lot of adjectives, I know, but still, it's a really interesting one for the way the contrast works. And then when they get to the end of the song, the coda, which is based on the music of the verse, continues. Well, the music of the music of the chorus and the verse together. It starts to. You get this manic increase in tempo, and it's like, if you've ever seen those kinds of the dances where the music just gets faster and faster and faster and faster, and then finally it ends with this big kind of spacey ending. So what does all that mean? Well, the lyrics seem to deal with a wealthy American woman a public figure who is very skillful in public. She knows what to say to everybody. She's unflappable. Nobody can ever throw her off her game. But she's a bit wilder behind the scenes. She seems like everything right and everything, all American on the surface, but get behind the scenes and things get a little bit different. Maybe having more to do with, have you seen your baby standing in the shadow? Have you seen your mother baby standing in the shadow than the image that she puts forth? And even, the lyrics would say, even maybe a little bit deadly. She shows her teeth. So this is a very interesting kind of portrait of maybe a powerful and influential woman who behind the scenes is a very different kind of person and maybe a little bit more of a party animal than her public image lets out. And that's what I think the strong musical contrasts are driven by. In other words, the strong musical contrasts are there to show the strong contrast between the external persona of this person and the internal sort of headspace of what's happening with this person. And this idea of letting the music make these kinds of statements about these contrasts in the lyrics, I think, is a pretty sophisticated way. We call it text painting in classical music. It's a very sophisticated way of sort of creating meaning in the music. So that means that if I'm right about that, what does this kind of speeding up at the end, this kind of manic acceleration of the music? Maybe it's some kind of crazy bacchanal, some kind of crazy orgy that happens after whatever the public event is that has to happen. Maybe that's what this is all about. It's the kind of culminating point. Who knows? But I would ask you to listen to the song again, listen to the lyrics, and see what you think about the way in which these two sections go together, and see what you think the ending then is supposed to be telling us, because there are no lyrics there. So you've got to guess from what the music is and the lyrics have been telling you what the ending tells you purely by musical means alone. Again, that we can say this about rock musicians says that they're doing something more than just trying to put hits on AM radio. There is a real kind of elevation of their game here. Musical ambition, trying to do things that are more like what classical composers and what art music people do than like what typical brill building songwriters would do. So let's just review a little bit of what we've talked about this week. 1966 and early 1967 show the Stones producing increasingly mature and ambitious music, dominated by Jagger and Richards' originals. Remember, the big way in this week was all of a sudden these albums have got tons of original songs on it. The covers are gone. The arrangements become more experimental, and we've been talking a lot about that, working different kinds of instruments and giving Brian Jones a lot of credit for being able to play all those different instruments that make their way into these Rolling Stones tunes. And then finally, thinking about the cover versions from earlier albums and how they might exert influence on these originals that we've been talking about, as well as some of the contemporary influences of people like Dylan and the Beach Boys and the Beatles, and the contemporary movement of artists away from the craftsman model toward the artist model. So when we blend all that together, I think we can see that if 1965 was the year of satisfaction in terms of commercial success, 1966 becomes the first year where the Stones really established themselves as kind of mature artists doing primarily their own music. And I think it's a real turning point for them. Well, what we've got coming ahead next week is I think a very interesting point in the group's history. The first half of it, the rest of 1967, have them being involved in their Satanic Majesty's Request, an album that a lot of critics don't like at all. They think it's a real loser. I will argue, on the other hand, that I think it's in many ways a fantastic record. But there's no doubt about it, 1967 is a pretty confusing year for the Stones as they try to struggle through the drug charges and the conviction and the various kinds of things that go with it and the publicity. And then as we get into 1968, the story is that the Stones' style changes and turns back to something that rejects psychedelia. But I'll argue that's not entirely true. Anyway, I'll save those arguments for next week. Psychedelia and beyond.